Modern democracies operate on the assumption that their courts are independent. We visualize them as solid, immovable pillars of justice. But on a mechanical level, many of these systems are wired for obedience. Protecting the independence of a court is a systems engineering problem. When a politician controls a judge's paycheck or the length of their career, the court is captured. The judge remains in the robe, but the state holds the leverage. True independence requires a structural severance of the executive branch's influence. It requires specific architectural upgrades to the state machine. This is the blueprint for a state machine with 4 operational branches: executive, legislative, judicial, and the 4th branch, control. By isolating the judicial node, we can identify exactly where it remains vulnerable to the executive and legislative blocks. We are going to apply 3 mechanical upgrades to this specific component to hardwire it for independence. To understand why these upgrades are necessary, we have to look at how the baseline system fails. Human systems have a baseline vulnerability, the drive for self-preservation. Judges, like anyone else, have professional ambitions. This creates an opening for promotion blackmail. The executive branch doesn't need to give a judge direct orders. It simply controls the path to their next promotion. A judge who issues an inconvenient ruling can be quietly sidelined, denied a seat on a higher court, or transferred to a remote district without their consent. Term limits create a similar hostage dynamic. If a judge has a set expiration date on their mandate, they are forced to consider their reappointment every time they rule on a state matter. If a judge's career survival depends on a politician's approval, their rulings will statistically align with the interests of the state. The first systemic upgrade is the introduction of the immortal judge. This requires lifelong appointments. For the highest courts, mandates should extend to age 65 or 75, with no possibility of removal by the executive branch. This structural change removes the threat of demotion. You cannot leverage a legally guaranteed career. Historical data proves that this mechanism effectively counters executive pressure. When Dwight D. Eisenhower was asked about the mistakes he made during his presidency, he pointed to only 2, and both were sitting in the Supreme Court. They refused to follow his lead. This permanent status is what allows a high court to function independently of the politicians who originally appointed them. Lifelong tenure forces judges to answer only to the law and their own conscience. By making the position permanent, the state loses its primary method of intimidation. The second vector of attack is financial pressure. Even a judge with a lifetime appointment can be influenced by the prospect of corporate wealth or simple bribery. A secure system cannot rely on the individual ethics of a judge. It must rely on a hard-coded mathematical formula. This salary algorithm removes the financial incentive for corruption by mathematically decoupling a judge's income from outside influence. Starting with the average national salary, the sitting president's is capped at 20 times that average. The Chief Justice, however, is hard-coded at 35 times. This mandates that the judge is the highest-paid official in the state. The algorithm makes purchasing a judge economically unfeasible for most bad actors. When a judge's legal income is this high, the risks of bribery far outweigh the potential rewards. The final vulnerability is the legislative monopoly on legal reality. This is the Code Napoleon. It represents the continental legal system, where laws are purely prescriptive and every scenario is supposedly written down in advance for the judge to follow. Because these laws are broad, 2 different judges looking at the same crime can arrive at completely different results, one sentencing a defendant to 5 years and another to 40. The final upgrade integrates elements of Anglo-Saxon precedent law to standardize these outcomes. This system transfers the power to interpret the spirit of the law from politicians to the High Court. The legal system becomes a dynamic, evolving network. The court creates granular rules for special situations based on past cases. If a new case is similar to a previous one, the earlier ruling sets the mandatory standard. This precedent engine prevents the legislature from manipulating legal definitions on a whim. It ensures that the interpretation of the law remains consistent from the top of the judiciary down to the smallest courtroom. This is the model of a newly engineered state. Lifelong tenure ensures that judges cannot be fired for inconvenient rulings. The salary algorithm removes the financial pressure of bribery. And the precedent engine prevents politicians from rewriting legal definitions to suit their needs. This diagram shows the structural hierarchy. The Supreme Court sits at the top, supervising the entire system, to ensure that every lower court adheres to the established legal standard. Judicial independence is a product of fixed mechanics and structural math. When these are correctly applied, the machine works regardless of political intent.